Thank you for joining today's See You on the Weekend webinar titled Can Humans Live with Wildfire? We'll be starting the program in just a minute or two to get everyone a chance to log in. Thank you for your patience.
Greetings. Welcome to See You on the Weekend. This is an ongoing series of lectures featuring the cutting-edge research of CU Boulder's world-class faculty. We're very pleased to have you with us today for a webinar entitled Can Humans Live with Wildfire? My name is David Means, and I'll be your moderator. I am the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which sponsors this series. Just a few logistics before we start the presentation. Attendees may submit questions by clicking on the question and answer or Q&A button located at the bottom of the Zoom window. These will be sent to the presenter as well as the moderators for their consideration and will not be visible to other participants. Due to the size of the audience, and we have well over 200 participants today, the chat function has been disabled for this talk. We may not have time to get to your questions, but we'll certainly do our best to address the themes and ideas that are most common. Please submit your questions throughout the talk as they occur to you. That will give us a chance to compile these questions and sort them in terms of themes and frequency, things like that. So as things come to mind throughout the lecture, just drop those into that Q&A box there, and we will address as many of those as we can. The webinar is being recorded, and this Monday, we will add a link to the recording on our website. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Today we have with us Hannah Brenkert-Smith, a research associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Institute of Behavioral Science. Hannah earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She was an Environmental Protection Agency STAR Fellow, a Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Academy of Sciences, and a postdoctoral fellow in the Climate Science and Applications Program at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Her research examines social environmental interactions in the face of environmental change, particularly in the American West. Over the past 20 years, her work has focused primarily on household and community response to wildfire risk. In recent years, her work has prioritized collaborative research practices that yield actionable data and insights for those working at the forefront of wildfire risk mitigation in the wildland urban interface. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Brenkert-Smith to See You on the Weekend.
Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. Thank you all for being here today. Okay, so really appreciate being here today. My talk today is called Can Humans Live with Wildfire? But what I really want to talk about is pathways to wildfire adaptation through evidence-based approaches. And I hope by the end of this talk, I will have been able to explain what I mean by this. So as David mentioned, I have been studying the social dimensions of wildfire for nearly 20 years. And I started this research in graduate school in the year after the Hayman fire burned west of Denver. Now, that fire, as many of you may recall, was, at the time, the biggest and most devastating fire our state had seen in many years. And for 18 subsequent years, until 2020, it was the state's largest recorded wildfire, having burned nearly 140,000 acres. And while the size of that fire wasn't eclipsed again until 2020 with the Pine Gulch and Cameron Peak fires, it has been a very active 20 years with devastating fires, dozens of lives lost, and thousands of homes burned. Now, it was right around the time of the Hayman fire in the early 2000s that we started seeing funding and support for the social science to be directed towards looking at the social dimensions of wildfire. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about a unique researcher practitioner team called the WIRE team, or Wildfire Research, that is working to help build wildfire adaptation pathways using evidence-based approaches. But before I do that, I'm going to put wildfire risk to human communities into a bit of context so that we're on the same page as I talk about that. So in most wildfire talks, the presenter will start by hearkening back to simpler times when one could reasonably argue that humans lived with wildfire relatively successfully. In North America, we know that indigenous peoples didn't simply live with fire, but they actively harnessed it to thin vegetation, to herd animals for a hunt, to control weeds, and to prepare soils for planting. Fire was a tool that was used strategically to manage lands. We also know that times are a lot more complex now, and how we might live with fire likely needs to look different, but there are lessons to be learned by looking back. And so as I continue my talk, please keep in mind that one critical lesson from looking back is that we know that many ecosystems are actually fire dependent, and that many forests actually need fire or some kind of replacement management strategy to remain healthy. And the forest ecologists could give you a rundown of different kinds of forests and their fire needs, but I am not that kind of researcher. What I study is humans, people and the communities who are the recipients of the effects when wildfires move from being regular, small scale, low impact events to those that result in catastrophic losses. Those same humans and communities, those people are also key stakeholders who play a critical role in shaping the future of wildfire. And I mostly look at humans and communities who have yet to be directly affected by wildfire in order to better understand what do they know and understand about wildfire risk? How do they think about the risk that it poses, especially in the context of their broader decision-making. And what are they doing to reduce that risk? What motivates them? What enables them to take action before a catastrophic fire in order to reduce the likelihood of it happening? One of the reasons I am focused on the time frame before a major wildfire event is that there are many, many more people and communities who have yet to directly face a fire than those who are already fire affected and who are working on recovery. We also know that for every dollar spent on wildfire hazard mitigation, there is a $4 savings in expenditures to deal with a wildfire event. So if we can understand that front end better, we can increase the chances of reducing that risk, and we can hopefully learn to live with fire. So I promise there are going to be some graphs at the very beginning, but I promise this talk is not populated with a bunch of graphs. So just hang in there for this front end. When I was a graduate student, first working on the social aspects of wildfire, I sometimes really worried that my energies might be misplaced. As you can see, hazard losses and average annual losses and hazard-related deaths due to wildfire paled in comparison to other natural hazards. Now, by the time I was a postdoc at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in 2009, I still worried that the damages and losses due to wildfire were far outshadowed by those caused by other hazards. And yet climate science told us that change was afoot and that bigger change was on the horizon. So climate science has been predicting the changes that we are seeing now. They've been predicting it for a while. So a significant contribution to the fire behavior, the climate and fire literature in 2006, and now this is 15 years ago, demonstrated that there were three dynamics afoot. First, they saw that there was a relationship between spring and summer temperatures and when the fire season starts. As those temperatures increase, so does fire frequency. Second, they saw that the timing of the spring snow melt was related to the length of the fire season. The earlier the snow melts, the earlier the fire season starts. And finally, the fire season is not only starting earlier, but it's lengthening. And now, 15 years later, the firefighting community rarely talks about a fire season anymore. Wildfires are with us year-round. And these trends have put an enormous stress on the humans who work at the forefront of wildfire suppression, as well as ever-increasing costs to society. So as that fire season lengthens and increases in destruction, we see escalating fire suppression costs. Since 2000, the average annual federal wildfire suppression cost has been around $3.7 billion. Now, critically, as suppression costs increase, they've been consuming larger and larger portions of budgets that could be going towards forest management, ecological conservation, and restoration. So the practice of fire borrowing, which has been to take money out of the forest management budget and put it towards fire suppression, has been occurring for a long time, such that as of 2015, half of the Forest Service budget was spent on firefighting. And this year, in 2021, it's estimated that 67% of the Forest Service budget is going to be spent on firefighting. It's also estimated that collectively, we're spending 30 times the annual suppression costs on other direct and indirect expenditures, from home losses to watershed recovery, and an enormous portion of that ends up being covered by local entities. So this map depicts where wildfire poses the greatest risk to human communities in Colorado. These areas are what we call the wildland-urban interface. The wildland-urban interface is the area where the fuels for fire transition from natural sources, so trees and grasses and shrubs, to human-made sources such as homes, decks, fences, propane tanks, firewood piles, and where we shift from fires burning on public lands to fires burning on an intermix of public and private lands. Now, when fire starts in or transitions into the wildland-urban interface, we see ecological damage, as well as loss of homes and businesses and other infrastructure. And these damages can have a great cost to society. Last year's Cameron Peak Fire burned 208,000 acres, 469 structures. It cost over $132 million to suppress. Private property losses were estimated to be around 100 million. And after the fire, there are and continue to be significant ecological issues, including erosion and water quality. Where wildfire risk is high on public and private properties, the responsibility of attending to those conditions on the ground before a fire expands from just being a public land management issue to a management issues that fall on private property owners individually, as well as to communities and municipalities collectively to work toward conditions that reduce the likelihood of catastrophic fire. Now, this map is from 2004 and it was made by the Colorado State Forest Service. And there are many, many more current maps that integrate all sorts of really interesting data about flame length or estimated damages. And there's been, has been some growth and expansion around these red areas. The wildland urban interface is growing, but really this map provides a very good picture of the primary areas of concern when it comes to wildfire risk to Colorado. So the wildland urban interface is vast and varied, from tiny enclaves of homes nestled in the woods to communities that ring major metro areas. As of 2010, approximately 1/3 of the homes in the United States were in the wildland urban interface. And it's been the fastest growing type of land use with an increase of 145% from 1990 to 2015. Nearly half the homes in the West are in the wildland urban interface, but just about 1/3 of the potential wildland urban interface is developed, meaning that there remains enormous growth potential. Currently, there are few regulatory measures or mechanisms to ensure that development is designed so that homes are accessible to fire response and that roads can accommodate evacuation. New development and communities can be subject to land use codes where they're implemented, and similarly, new homes can be subject to building codes where they're implemented. And such codes can help ensure that this expansion is done in a manner that reduces risk. New codes, however, do not apply retroactively. And so the existing wildland urban interface communities, if you look back at that map from 2004, this is where the homes are aging and vegetation continues to grow. And this is a critical area of concern. Now, luckily, fire science provides amazing understanding on how fire behaves. And this science provides guidance on what needs to happen in fire-prone communities. And fire science has been translated into actionable recommendations on the ground for property owners living in the wildland urban interface. But just because you know what needs to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. If that were the case, we would be all eating enough fruits and vegetables, we would be getting plenty of exercise and sleep. Now, luckily, these days, there is widespread acceptance and understanding that because of the vast and varied character of the wildland urban interface, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. In fact, it's a core part of the language of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. And this is the document that provides our national level guidance on wildfire. And we have many, many folks at work working on this problem on the ground to tailor solutions to landscapes and communities that they serve, from local fire departments to county wildfire programs, to regional wildfire councils, to statewide wildfire organizations, to national networks of wildfire practitioners. And Colorado, I will say, is noteworthy in these efforts. But most programs, they lack the data to inform strategies to tailor their work effectively and efficiently to move their communities toward adoption of risk mitigation actions. These are the kinds of organizations that become the partners with my team to collaborate to do our work. And so now I've shared a little bit of the background of wildfire. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the kind of research I do and the data we collect. So my team is called the Wildfire Research Team, WIRE, and we've got some core concepts that guide our thinking. First, residents in the wildland urban interface are critical actors in the wildfire problem. Their lives and properties are exposed to wildfire hazards, and they could take action to reduce risk. Our goal is to use social science to foster understanding for the development of effective wildfire programs that result in behavioral change towards greater adaptation. Action is central to adaptation. We work to identify the determinants of mitigation and preparedness actions. Such determinants may include risk perceptions, attitudes, beliefs about wildfire, barriers and incentives, and how those function in their specific context. People and their decisions are complex. Because anecdotes and assumptions can be misleading, we focus on collecting systematic local social science data to foster understanding of the community and context in which residents make their decisions. And finally, decisions are not made in a vacuum. Social and situational context matters, particularly when it comes to decisions related to taking action. People are influenced by neighbor interactions, community level actions, programs, local experts, and the WIRE approach attends to those social processes while also seeking to understand differences across contexts. Okay, so the wildfire approach to wildfire adaptation is research embedded in practice, where the goal is that the properties that make up the wildland-urban interface are properly mitigated and that the people who live in those homes are prepared for a wildfire event. We start with a partnership with a local wildfire organization, and we work together to understand each other's worlds. We learn about their programs, what they want to achieve, what they think is happening in their communities, their priorities, their obstacles, what they most want to know about the communities that they serve. And then we craft a letter together and we send it out to the community. And this lets the property owners know what's happening and that their participation is welcome and encouraged in the project. So then our partners on the ground, who are wildfire practitioners, conduct a rapid wildfire risk assessment. Now, our rapid wildfire risk assessment is a data collection effort that includes all the properties in the study area with a home on them. And it's just a quick look comprised of 13 attributes that include background characteristics. So that's distance to dangerous topography, the slope of the property, the proximity to adjacent homes, home characteristics, so that's what the roofing and siding materials are, the presence of combustible decking or fencing that may be attached to the home, whether or not there are combustibles near the home, so vegetation near the home and other combustibles in that area that is commonly called the defensible space area, defensible space zone, and then also the presence and quality of access and egress that enables fire suppression and evacuation. Now together, what these provide is a snapshot in time. This is a 1-minute look at a property. What it does altogether though, is it provides the relative risk of properties across the study area. This step alone has been critical for our practitioner partners who run small, resource-constrained organizations and who have to decide where and how to allocate their funding and how to allocate the time of their limited staff. Okay, so now we've done the rapid risk assessments. Once those are completed, then we administer a household survey. Now we work together with our partners to tailor these household surveys, although all our surveys contain core batteries that we ask in every study that we conduct. We conduct a census of our study areas, and we do this for one really important reason. When we first started doing research in the wildland-urban interface, we used much more traditional research approaches. So for example, we did a study in Boulder and Larimer counties in 2007, and we conducted a random sample of homeowners in the wildland-urban interfaces of both counties. Now, a random sample is a very traditional research approach, and we had a nice response rate and we learned some things. But when we talked to the Boulder and Larimer County wildfire specialists, we realized that we never had enough observations. We had never had enough survey responses from any one community in their area that could help us tell them what was happening in the community they were trying to serve. We could say some general things about Boulder and Larimer County residents in high-risk communities, but we could not provide any insights that attended to the complexity that's tied to the fact that different communities have different characters, and that the social dynamics in those different communities likely play a role in how any one community might approach wildfire risk mitigation. So now we conduct a census. And our response rates have ranged in the last few years from 36 to 55%, which is excellent. Some communities within a project study area have had as many as 70% of owners responding. Okay, so now we've done the rapid risk assessment and the household survey. And next we work on understanding our data. So first we pair together the rapid risk assessment with the household survey responses. So that way we know about the conditions on that property, as well as the people who live on that property. And then we initiate in an engaged and iterative process with our project partners. We use these data to fuel conversations about how they might adapt their approaches and their programs to move the communities they serve forward toward that goal of properly mitigated properties and prepared residents. Okay, so now we have background. We've got a bit about wildfire. You now know about the data we collect and how we partner with the organizations. And so now I'm going to tell you a few stories about how our data are being used. So we really maintain that adaptation requires changing conversations. And that starts with using evidence to understand the world that we're working in rather than relying on assumptions. So we've been partnering with West Region Wildfire Council since 2012. This is a small nonprofit based in Montrose, Colorado, that serves 6 Western Colorado counties. Now, West Region, as we call them, has proven to be a critical partner in the development of our approach to doing this research, the WIRE approach. So we did a project in the town of Mountain Village in San Miguel County in 2014. The town of Mountain Village is near Telluride, and the local town council was convinced that their community was primarily made up of owners who live there for the trees and would be unwilling to remove those trees to reduce risk. The conversation in that town council suggested that the topic was a non-starter and that they would get negative feedback if they even broached the topic in their community. And this seemed like a problem to our partners at West Region. So they wanted to do a WIRE project and collect data. And so with data in hand, the then executive director of West Region attended a town council meeting and she shared some results. First, she reported back that 77% of the household survey respondents reported that they would be willing to remove trees to reduce wildfire risk. Then she shared that nearly half of the survey respondents indicated that they lived in an area with a homeowners association that had rules about cutting trees. Now, those rules may have been as simple as needing to apply for a permit, but they were functioning as a barrier to reducing wildfire risk. Those 2 pieces of data were transformational in moving the town council from anecdotes and assumptions about the community to using evidence to change the conversation. Their assumptions dispelled, they immediately had a pathway to move forward. And that was to start working with the homeowners association to revise and review rules about trees and vegetation management within the communities. The process was very successful, and the town of Mountain Village started building wildfire risk reduction programs, including establishing mitigation incentive programs, a roof replacement incentive program to help owners replace those cedar shake shingle roofs that were so popular in the 70s and 80s and which are so very flammable. The town of Mountain Village was often doing the work that had been supported by West Region Wildfire Council, and to this day, they are very active. So adaptation also requires changing outcomes. We cannot just have a conversation about a better world, we have to build it. And it requires that we track those changed outcomes so that we have evidence about what works and what doesn't. So West Region Wildfire Council also partnered with us on a project in 2012 in Log Hill Mesa in Ouray County, Colorado. Now, at that time, West Region had a chipping program, and this program provided support in helping residents chip the cut trees and branches, called slash, so they could be hauled away. At that time, West Region had 51 participants in Log Hill Mesa in that program. They had chipped 76 piles of wood or slash. We learned from the household survey that 35% of respondents struggled with slash management, meaning they didn't have a way to dispose of the vegetation that they had cut to reduce wildfire risk. With these data in hand, West Region gathered some resources, they used the data to bolster their grant applications, and they grew their chipping program. Now in 2017, we were lucky enough to be able to repeat the study. So we have 2 points in time. So by 2017, only 13% of survey respondents were struggling with how to dispose of that slash. And the chipping program had 118 participants in Log Hill Mesa, and collectively they had chipped 399 piles. Now, West Region used the success to continue to apply for grants to enable them to continue their assistance and expand their assistance to communities. And we are lucky enough to be launching a new project in Ouray and Montrose counties this fall. And that project is supported in part by the CU Outreach Awards program. So we've been in Colorado now for a little while. We're going to travel outside of Colorado and talk about some work we did in Eastern Washington. Now, wildfire has plagued many areas of Eastern Washington, and it has also sent Colorado a good bit of smoke. In Eastern Washington, we worked with Chelan County Fire District 1 that serves Wenatchee, Washington, and parts of the county's wildland urban interface. And there we focused our work on an area called the Swill Truck Drainage, which is a big continuous drainage that runs from the Columbia River down at the bottom of the slide up to the Mission Ridge ski area. The terrain and the vegetation are as varied as the homes and the communities that populate that drainage. So we completed the WIRI data collection process, so the rapid risk assessments and the homeowner surveys. And then we looked at the different community areas that make up the drainage. Now, this map is upside down compared to the photo you just saw, but it's the same terrain with the river there, and then it's going up to Forest Ridge there, which is at the top of the hills near that Mission Ridge ski area. So the area is parsed into 4 broad community areas. And so the graph on the right shows that the rapid risk assessment data across that entire drainage demonstrated that those different areas had different levels of risk and likely warranted different kinds of attention based on those risk assessment and different kinds of interventions. Now, this wasn't an enormous eureka moment for our partners. They knew the landscape. What this did, though, was verified their understandings, and it provided very specific pathways to move forward and the data to back it up. So I'm going to give you some examples from that. Okay, so as I explained, we collect the rapid risk assessments and then we pair them with the household survey. Now, in the survey, we ask respondents to assess their own risk through the same measures that the local professional uses. And so then we can compare how the owner sees the property compared to how the local fire professional does. And what we consistently see is that survey respondents underestimate their risk compared to the local wildfire professionals. Now, much of the wildfire social science has demonstrated that wildland urban interface residents are aware of the risk they face, but this result helps us take a deeper look, and it suggests that how a resident sees their property varies from how a wildfire professional sees their property. In this case, across the communities in that drainage, we see that 81% of the survey respondents thought that their property's risk should be characterized as low or moderate. And you can see very well from this graph that the professionals saw those properties quite differently. Now, since that risk assessment is parsed into those 13 attributes I described previously, we can actually look at each of those individually. And we can use that to understand what's driving that mismatch. So here we compare how the professionals assess the distance between the home and nearby dense or overgrown vegetation. So that space is often called the defensible space zone. We can see that nearly half the survey respondents thought that they had more than 100 feet between their home and what would be considered dense or overgrown vegetation. And that's a very different story from how the professionals saw those properties. So we see that 54% of the properties were characterized as having less than 30 feet of defensible space by the professionals. Now, the point here is not some gotcha game to show that the residents don't get it, that they don't understand risk. Rather, the point is to try to understand how the survey respondents understand the conditions that they face so that the local professionals can have the conversations, can tailor the programs, can develop the interventions and the incentives to best meet those local understandings. Since the data can show us what attributes are driving risk, I've got some more examples of how this fire district moved forward with the data. So in one community in particular, it was clear that the immediate area around the home was, they were particularly laden with fuels. With these data, the local fire department applied for a grant to subsidize hardscaping materials. So that's putting materials like rock that cannot ignite directly against the base of the structure. So lots of homes ignite because fire runs along the ground, hits the side of a structure and goes up, right? So the hardscaping around that home prevents that kind of fire dynamic. And fire science has shown that this is a really critical type of mitigation to prevent home ignition. Now they started that, they applied for a grant and they got it approved because they had the data to demonstrate the need. And then they started the work at the fire station in order to demonstrate what it might look like and also to draw attention and encourage participation. In another community, which was comprised of closely situated mobile homes, it was apparent from the risk assessment that non-vegetative combustibles stored near the home contributed significantly to the risk. The household survey also identified that the cost to mitigate and the lack of specific information about risk mitigation were notable barriers. So again, the fire district used the data to apply for a grant that paid for dumpsters to be brought to the community for a cleanup weekend. That weekend, the fire district worked with communities, talked about wildfire, hauled off a half dozen enormous dumpsters filled with combustibles that had been stored next to homes. And in doing so, they also built goodwill and they engendered trust in the local fire district and opened new avenues of communication that the district had struggles establishing. Now, this is a map of Washington State showing the distance from the study area in the center there in Chelan County to adjacent fire protection districts with which there were memorandums of understandings, MOUs. These are agreements between fire departments that they will show up with fire suppression resources in the event of a wildfire. The wildfire mitigation coordinator for Chelan Fire District 1, our partners, made this map because the household survey data indicated two things. First, over half of our survey respondents thought that the local fire district would be able to save their home in the event of a wildfire. And this was an outcome that the local fire district was confident would not be possible in a significant wildfire event. Second, nearly 3/4 of our survey respondents thought that local responders had sufficient resources, which again, the local fire district assured us was not actually the case. Understanding these community perspectives enabled the local fire district to initiate conversations with residents to help them better understand how a wildfire event might unfold and how resource constraints might influence the likelihood of their home being saved. And there's one last example from this study. We know that at least one local burn boss, so that is a person who plans and conducts prescribed burns on adjacent public lands, learned that the survey data showed high, though not uniform, but high acceptability of fuel management on public lands. So that included the use of prescribed fire. So with these data, he revised his burning strategy to expand the footprints of the burns that he had planned to do, which according to him, increases the efficacy of his work. He was also able to lengthen the needed return interval in any particular place, which increased the cost effectiveness and efficiency of his work. Okay, so now we're going to start to wrap up by talking about how we are expanding the evidence. One of the great challenges in understanding the social aspects of the populations in the wildland urban interface is that there isn't just some data set to go to help us understand. There's census data, but those don't really tell us about how people grapple with and make decisions about the risks they face, or what barriers prevent them from taking action, or what might help them take the next step. So we have to collect the evidence. Now, I mentioned that we've had great responses to our surveys. In 2020, before the East Troublesome Fire burned in Grand County, Colorado, we had a project in 6 communities in Grand County, Colorado, and it garnered a 50% response rate. And what we learned in Grand helps us understand those communities in Grand, but we don't know automatically if what we learned there can be used in other areas. Like I said, the wildland urban interface is vast and varied, and different communities have different characters, and those shape how they engage with wildfire. So one of the big efforts over the last year or the last couple of years has been to build a master data set. In this data set, we pulled together all the data from our projects. As I told you, there are core questions that we ask in every household survey that we do. And we put all those data together. And to our knowledge, this is the most extensive data set of its kind. And we're just at the point where we can start running analyses to help us understand what insights, what findings are specific to a particular area, and what insights apply to broader areas and can be generalized. So if there are any eager graduate students out there with great quantitative skills, reach out to me. We're expanding our evidence in other ways. We're expanding our temporal considerations by using baseline data from the WIRE approach to help chart trajectories for community recovery after a wildfire. So we are working with the Community Mitigation Assistance Team in Grand County, Colorado. This is a federal team that is deployed to a fire-affected area to help move communities toward mitigation as part of the recovery process. The team was deployed to Grand County following the East Troublesome Fire, and we were able to provide them with data that will serve as a baseline understanding for some of those communities in that area. And we've actually recently submitted a research proposal seeking funding to revisit the area to collect data so we can look at change over time before and after a fire. We're also expanding our partners and geographies with work in Colorado, New Mexico, Washington, Wyoming, and we have new work that's starting in Alaska and Colorado in 2022. So can humans live with fire? Yes, mostly because we must learn to live with fire. Learning to live with fire, though, will require moving from assumptions to evidence, changing conversations, changing and measuring outcomes, and collecting and leveraging evidence about what works, and tracking change over time. And finally, in conclusion, I have to take a moment to acknowledge my extraordinary team. Some of us have been working together for nearly 20 years. And to our practitioner partners and partnering organizations, they enter into this process with earnest curiosity and a passion to make the world a better place. We could not do the work without them. They give us their trust, and we are delighted when we can share out the amazing results of their work. And also to the respondents of the surveys, their voices are so critical to growing our understanding of how we are going to build this pathway to wildfire adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brenkert-Smith, for that presentation. For folks who are on the call, if you missed the beginning, I'll repeat now that you can submit your questions for Professor Brenkert-Smith through the Q&A function, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your Zoom window. And keep those coming as they come to you. So Hannah, to begin with, we've got a couple sort of general questions that are pretty specific about data that might be easily dealt with. A person named Colin just submitted this. I currently live in Grand County and I'm curious to see the 2020 data set. Is it possible to find that online? Is this data public?
So the data is not online. So when we go through this process, the data really becomes the property of our partners as we see it. But I am more than happy to have a conversation. You can reach out to me. My contact information, I'm sure, is available through the website. I'm happy to have a conversation with you about the availability of the data, for sure.
Great. So a couple of questions have come through that have to do with the methods of this research. And when you do your quick assessments, Joe asked this, how large are the areas you tend to do research in? What's the geographic scope of this kind of research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I have a great answer to that. It has really varied. We did, it really varies. I'd say on average, we're looking at communities that have about 500 households. We have done areas that are both bigger and smaller than that. We try to do projects where we'll have enough observations where we can say something meaningful with the data. And as some communities, we have smaller enclaves that together constitute the study area. And so they're dispersed across a larger area. And sometimes they're very compact. And so geographically, they're a smaller area, but may have many, many more houses. So it varies greatly, just like the wildland urban interface.
So a related question, are these surveys pretty standardized across communities, or are they tailored to the specific situation of a location?
Yeah, so I would say more than 3/4 of it are standard. And then there are pieces in it that are tailored. So for example, we're really interested in where people are getting their wildfire risk information and how useful they find that information. And so that list of possible sources of wildfire risk information is always tailored to the local context, because there are different players in the field. If you were in Utah, the Utah Department of Natural Resources and United Fire Authority would be on that list, which you would never have in Wyoming or Colorado. So those portions are always tailored. We also engage our partners in a process to try to identify if there are really specific issues that they need to know more about. So we did work up in Teton County, Wyoming, where evacuation was a particular concern. And so we built out a much bigger battery of questions about evacuation preparedness in order to help them and their emergency manager understand what was happening in terms of residents being prepared for evacuation. So I would say about 3/4 is standard and the rest is tailored, although we are working on finding ways to help bridge. Well, I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
So Kenneth asked early on, what is a wildfire? And aren't there any wildfires in eastern Colorado or Moffat County? I take that to be sort of a definitional question of what counts as a wildfire versus some other kind of event.
Yeah, there's certainly wildfires in Moffat County and the east. Wildfire really is any fire that's burning that is not controlled or planned. And certainly the eastern plains, there are grass prairie fires, and ground fires can prove to be very dangerous to homes and communities and infrastructure. Although you don't see the kind of extreme fire behavior that you might see when the fuels are much bigger, like in a significant forest.
So Sandy asks this question, the effects of massive wildfires go well beyond the immediate burn area. Are you or any of your colleagues looking at the effects of poor air quality from wildfires on the communities downwind?
Yeah, this is such an important issue. I think there were maybe 100 days of smoke last year in Denver. And it is obviously an increasingly important area. I haven't done any work on smoke. We did work in Ashland, Oregon, and we asked in that survey, so that was one of the tailored portions for that study. We asked about smoke mitigation behaviors, but overall we have not focused particularly on that, but there is work being done on smoke, both in terms of measuring the content of the smoke, comparing wildfire smoke with say prescribed fire smoke. And this is a really big area of concern and an area of research that I am confident will grow. And there are, so Colleen Reed here at CU Boulder looks at the health effects of smoke. And there are also atmospheric chemists who look at that composition and also the role that smoke plays in terms of contributing to climate change.
Some of the questions coming in here indicate how personal and practical this topic is for many of our audience members. Beverly asks this question: many of us who live in the areas described have spent a lot of time and money mitigating our properties. Do you have data regarding areas that have taken mitigation steps and how they do if they're hit by a wildfire?
This is a great question. Sorry, I'm trying to compose my thoughts for this. We are, I assume that the question about how they do has to do in terms of the efficacy of that work when it comes to a fire burning. And we actually in Grand County, we have data of the conditions of properties in an area where the fire burned. And we are looking at the extent to which those conditions are tied to whether or not homes were lost. That work is still really preliminary and it's not out yet. We've shared back results with our practitioner partners on the ground, but we haven't shared it out publicly yet. We're working on that. And this is a really important question that you're asking because the fire science provides the guidance that practitioner organizations around the country use. And there have been some studies looking at, it's kind of an, I'm not sure, a forensic account of what happens in a community when a fire burns through. But so often what's lacking are the data from before the fire. So it's very hard to reconstruct what happened in a community when a fire burns if you don't have that baseline data. And also you need to have the data on what suppression was used, where was there a fire truck parked in front of this house and that's why it survived, or did it survive because of the mitigation? And that kind of real in-depth and complex forensic account of post-fire is really difficult to cobble together without those data. And it's one of the reasons that we feel like our data is particularly important, so we can start answering that question better, because I don't think we can answer it well yet.
Nancy asked, how do you achieve defensible space in higher density neighborhoods where the houses are often 10 feet apart? This person notes that they live on University Hill in Boulder, which for some of us, that gives us a nice visual of what that looks like.
Yeah, this is a great question. So, we know that fire burns in lots of different ways. And we know that in wildland urban interface disasters, we have a lot of home-to-home transmission. And in fact, you can look at lots of photos of burned areas where you see the trees are still standing, but it's the homes that have burned. So, and I am not a fire behavior expert. So what I am telling you is what I understand from working with fire practitioners. And that is that home hardening so that the home is less likely to ignite. So that has to do with the roofing material and the siding material, and also whether any attachments that come to that home are ignitable. So decks and fencing, but also that really regular maintenance of those fine fuels, so pine needles and leaves that gather on the gutters or right at the base of the home that could ignite easily. Those kinds of fine fuels in like when we're having really hot, dry, red flag weather are really critical. And what we know now is that most homes actually ignite from embers. I think we used to think about fire moving through these communities like a wall of flames moving through, and we see that's not actually what's happening, partly through those forensic accounts, that the embers are really important. And so that's so also the screening for vents need to be small, and Boulder County Wildfire Partners is a great county program here in Boulder, and they've got really in-depth information on their website about the home hardening pieces. And that includes the details of that screening to make sure that if there are embers, that they don't get pulled into the home to ignite. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Great. So a question about, so much of what you've spoken to has to do with the importance of evidence and evidence-based decision-making in terms of land management and engagement with homeowners. Is there controversy or is there general agreement that you see amongst homeowners, residents versus the professionals, management professionals? Is it controversial what counts as legitimate evidence here? And do politics come into this in terms of who people trust for information regarding wildfire risk?
Need to think about how to answer your question. I don't know that there's controversy in terms of what constitutes evidence about wildfire risk. And in fact, I think most people who live in fire-prone areas are pretty aware of what they're facing. They may not understand fully the scope of the conditions, or they may not have all the scenarios in their mind that a wildfire professional may have. But there's pretty good understanding, and those more often we can have those conversations. We can understand the understandings of the residents who live in the fire-prone area. The better we're able to have the conversations about what that risk looks like, and to align those understandings. And there may be some political pieces to this, but I think generally, those local practitioners are generally very well regarded and well respected in their communities. We find that when we ask people where they get their information about wildfire risk, their primary source tends to be the local wildfire practitioners, and those tend to be the sources that are characterized as being the most useful. And I think that the more we can foster those relationships and enable those programs to grow in terms of resources and staffing, to do that kind of community development work that is not only critical to wildfire, but to other social and ecological challenges a community may be facing, the more we'll be supporting that pathway towards adaptation, not just for wildfire, but for improving society generally.
Great. So that maybe provides a nice segue to a question from Thomas. Has funding been forthcoming from the feds for this research?
Yeah, a great deal of my research over the last 20 years has been supported by the USDA Forest Service. The Forest Service has a great research group, the Rocky Mountain Research Station up in Fort Collins. And they have, and then there are research dollars through a Joint Fire Sciences program, which is really focused on research, which does both the biophysical and the social science pieces. And we've received received funding, and WIRE receives funding from Fire and Aviation Management, because increasingly it is being understood that wildfire isn't just a fuels and forest problem. Wildfire is a social problem, and that partnerships, public-private partnerships in this world, and so that means having everybody, all the stakeholders at the table, is so critical to moving us towards wildfire adaptation. And there's been a great deal of work looking at mapping how and where fire can transition from public lands into private lands. And so the Forest Service is very interested in mitigating that risk.
So a nice comment from Meg here that I'll read. Not really a question, just an expression of appreciation for the important work you are doing. Thank you. Also a great lecture. I think
Thanks,
that where there's not a question there. The question that I would like to link to that is, in terms of this work being valued within the higher education context, do you think that this kind of applied and community engaged work that you're doing, is that something that is actively supported at the university? Do you feel like that's changed over time in terms of how you've seen the sort of research that you do fitting within the context of higher education?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that my interests have always rested at the intersection of society and the environment. And I think that means I don't have a real traditional academic pathway. But I do feel like it's encouraged and supported. You know, the really great thing about the work that we're doing is that we are yielding these applied results, which for me is the most meaningful part of the work, because we interact with folks on the ground and we can see that it makes change in the world. But we're also, you know, when we have it's rigorous systematic data and we write peer-reviewed publications in the academic literature. And so we're contributing and in conversation with that broader audience. And so, you know, that is typically the metric for the academic side of things. And I think there is a growing appreciation for and recognition for the importance of doing both of those pieces. And I'm grateful for that, because I think without the applied piece, I wouldn't find the motivation that I do because of the applied piece.
Great. So I know, Hannah, in the lead up to this talk, we had some conversation about the difference between concern about fire ignitions and prevention versus wildfire management or mitigation. I'm wondering if you could speak to that distinction and how that fits into the work that you do.
Yeah, sure. So there's been research out of CU tracking by Jennifer Balch, tracking the ignitions, human versus natural ignitions, lightning. That work really fits in the kind of Smokey the Bear fire ignition prevention world. And that constitutes a very important piece of the overall approach to wild fire in forests. And then mitigation, though, it really is a different beast. And so risk mitigation is not about the prevention of ignitions. And so it's about changing the conditions on the ground so that when an ignition happens, whether it's natural or human, that the conditions don't lead to catastrophic fire. And so, you know, low impact, small scale fire, as I said earlier, is really good for our forest and for most forest environments. And so I think that it is important, obviously, to reduce unintended ignitions, human ignitions, especially when they're in remote areas. That's difficult. to suppress. But it's also really important that we shift our thinking away from thinking that fire should or can be excluded from all our landscapes and move towards thinking that if we're mitigating risk and reducing the likelihood of catastrophic fires, that we could actually move towards a future world where we're using fire more actively through prescribed burning and in a way that won't lead to catastrophic fires. And this is a really important piece about doing forest management in a way that is more sustainable. Mechanical treatments in forest areas are very expensive, and they are meant to mimic some of the natural processes, but they are not natural processes. And I, again, am not a forest ecologist, but yes, so the mitigation is about reducing or changing the conditions so that we can live with fire without it becoming catastrophic.
So there's a couple of questions that have come in that are, I see categorized under kind of general miscellaneous questions related to wildfire. One is, let's see, how does ash residue benefit or harm soil? Is that something that you have any knowledge of?
No, I'm sorry, a soil ecologist or would be a person for that, but that's outside of the scope of my understanding of the world.
All right. Another, which is kind of a multi-part question, I'll try and summarize it. In terms of prevention, this is framed, and so maybe, you know, the relevance related to your discussion about prevention that could be relevant here. But what percentage of cutting of trees are you recommending per unit of land? On what scientific basis? What tools are recommended to be used, and on what basis? And what carbon studies exist, environmental impact of these recommended practices?
Yeah, so I'm a social scientist, so I study the people. I defer to the scientists on those kinds of questions, the forest ecologists and the foresters who make the prescriptions. We don't implement any of these. What we do is we observe the people, how they respond to it, whether or not they see those kinds of management approaches as being complements to what they might be doing on their private properties, or maybe as substitutes. But and we're interested in how people perceive those kinds of activities, how acceptable they may be. You know, one thing that was interesting when we were up in Grand County working with that community mitigation assistance team is that we learned that a lot of the discussion in the room among the local leadership suggested that that residents in Grand County are perhaps anti-regulatory. And our data actually showed that that there was actually much higher acceptance of potential land and building regulations, and so those are than people had kind of anticipated about the communities. And so those are the pieces. It's the relationship between the people, people's perceptions of, understandings of, and relationship to forest management that is where I focus on. And I could not tell you a prescription for an acre of land and how many stems it should have, unfortunately. But there are plenty of great people at CU who do and can. It's just not me.
So an anonymous participant just asked, how does local human water use affect the fire process?
I'm not sure exactly what the person means by local water use. Not sure I can answer that. But we do know, of course, that fire affects water quality. Major catastrophic fires can really change. Obviously, when you have massive tree loss, you can have significant erosion, and that can lead to mudslides and all sorts of compromises to water quality. And that is an area of great concern. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I know what exactly the question was meant to ask.
And that anonymous participant, feel free to submit a follow-up if there's any clarification there that would be helpful for us. So one of the things that we really try and do with this series, See You on the Weekend, is to highlight the wide range of different types of activities that are going on in the university these days at a large, Research One university like CU Boulder. A couple of questions related to that, Hannah. What is it exactly that a research professor does that is different from other roles at the university? How does it fit into the teaching, research, and service missions of the university?
Yeah, so a research professor, research faculty lines are non-tenure track lines. And that means that we generally do not teach. And so I sit, for example, at the Institute of Behavioral Science. There are several research faculty here. We do go through a promotion process, which is like the tenure process to some extent, but a little bit different because we don't have a teaching portfolio. But the main thing that it means is that we are grant funded. And so we write grant proposals, and if we are funded, we have salary. And if we do not get funded, we do not have salary. But the beauty of the position is that we really craft, we spend all our time doing research, which if you love to do, you love the job. And we craft the questions that we think are important and interesting. And then we attend to, what's happening in the world and policy changes, and we seek funding to ask questions about that. When I started doing work on wildfire, I did not intend to work for 20 years on wildfire. I'm a sociologist. I'm interested in the interactions between humans and the environment broadly. But wildfire has remained a very interesting topic, and the questions continue to be interesting and challenging. And I've been lucky enough to knit together funding to do this work. And so I think, so that's the main difference is the tenure track versus the teaching faculty versus not teaching faculty. And that we are fully focused on doing research.
Thank you for that. So it looks like we do have some follow-up on that water use question. Let me try and get this right. Where does the water come from for resident household use, and does that deplete the water source and dry out the soil? I guess I'm taking this as, if the use of water increases the fire risk. And another participant suggested that maybe this person was meaning that water use would increase the amount of fuel by increasing the amount of vegetation, I take it.
Okay, yeah, sure, that's interesting. Well, so where people get water for irrigating their lawns, whether or not they do varies, right? So in the wildland urban interface, most folks are on well water. But that's a very simplistic statement, but there are many. So if you think about Ashland, Oregon, that's a good sized city with, I think, 6,000 residences, and they're all on city water. So that where people get their water varies enormously. And so I don't think there's any one thing to say about that could be correct. I do know that in some of the area where water constraints don't exist like they exist here in Colorado, there are some recommendations that people irrigate to keep, a moist soil and, greenery that is less flammable. But Colorado, we're water constrained. We're not going to be recommending that people water their lawns in order to anticipate whether or not in order to create conditions that might be less flammable. Rather, residents in fire-prone areas are encouraged to plant fire-resistant plants to take out things like juniper and other highly flammable shrubs, and to create that defensible space area so that there's space between the home and flammable vegetation. I hope that helps.
Great. So it looks like we are potentially winding down. We're actually addressing the bulk of the questions that are coming in, which is great. In terms of your expertise and background, climate change fits into that. And can you speak to how this work that you're describing in terms of understanding perceptions of wildfire risk, how does that connect with our thinking about climate change in terms of what adaptation strategies might consist of, or how we mitigate impacts, or even how we understand what those impacts are? Can you speak to that sort of intersection of thinking about climate change and this specific work that you've presented for us today?
Yeah, so we know, of course, that climate and fire behavior are tightly tied together, and that increases in temperature, increases in drought, decreases in precipitation, when and what kind of precipitation we get, all affect the conditions on the ground that can increase fire behavior and fire severity. And we know that, that the beetle outbreaks that we've seen all through Colorado are also tied to climate change, and that has made those forests more vulnerable to significant wildfires. So really, climate, we don't really deal with it directly in our research, but it is absolutely the backdrop of the story, right? We have, we have multiple factors going on that make the wildland-urban interface fire prone. We have climate change, we have expansion of the wildland-urban interface, and those conditions are really ripe for having more people and lives and properties at risk. Since we're really focused on hazard risk reduction in terms of wildfire, the behaviors that any one household can undertake directly for wildfire are about that defensible space activity, the characteristics of the home and the property that we cover in that risk assessment. Those are the kinds of steps that a person can take on their property to reduce their immediate risk. Now, we can all work towards and support climate change mitigation policies and funding, and that will collectively help reduce risk. But really, the work here that I described today is really about hazard mitigation on those private properties, and then collectively within those communities to reduce risk. And that risk will, in fire-prone areas, that will continue regardless and grow relatedly to climate change.
Thank you for that. One very technical question here has to do with fire retardant plants. And do you have any, suggestions of what some of the most common or useful fire retardant plants would be that people can?
It will depend on where you are, right, and what is recommended in your area. So my recommendation is that you go to your local fire program, whether it's the local fire department or if there's a fire council or a county level program, and they will surely have the recommendation that is appropriate for your area. That really varies if you're in Colorado, even depending on the elevation that you're at. So I would recommend reaching out, do a search for your local entity. And if you're living in a fire-prone area, making that connection with that local program is a great door to open. You'll find somebody on the other end who wants to help.
Great. So more of a social sciences question here from Kenneth. Are there differences in perspectives between urban wildland and rural landowners about wildfire and wildfire mitigation approaches?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, right, the wildland urban interfaces we've talked about is vast and varied. And as I mentioned, we are just getting to the point where we have a data set where we can start parsing that. And I couldn't tell you what we're going to find exactly in that. I do know that when we are reporting out on our individual studies, we are often struck by some different dynamics. We just did a project in Teton County, Wyoming, and everybody there, not everybody, a large portion of the respondents were very supportive of really every public land management approach to fuel reduction that we listed. But they did not want any regulatory measures on building and zoning and land use overall. Low support for that. And then we did a project around the same time in Utah, and it was really flipped. And so in that community, people were saw very low support for that public land management work, but very high support for the kinds of building codes and within community regulatory measures. And so, yes, it does vary a great deal. I don't think I could easily characterize urban wildland urban interface versus rural wildland urban interface, but there is some great research out of University of Idaho, Professor Paveglio, who looks at kind of community type and characterizing the different kinds. So what he's done is taken a bunch of qualitative case studies and then characterized wildland urban interface in these archetypes to try to begin describing the ways in which different kinds of communities and how they relate to the landscape and their populations and how that is related to how people engage with wildfire. So communities that are resource dependent and are working the land may have the tools and the know-how and the historical knowledge of how to deal with fire in a different way than a much more kind of suburban wildland urban interface. And his work really begins to deal with, I think, that question you're looking at.
Excellent. So a question about population growth in Colorado, for example. I know that affordable housing makes headlines as a major issue in mountain communities, for example. To what extent is population growth in the urban wildland interface a factor in the situation that you're trying to understand?
Yeah, so I don't think I could quantify the extent to which it's an issue, but the wildland urban interface in Colorado is growing. That means there are more properties being developed, there are more people, there are more homes at risk. And as I mentioned that, when we look at the older housing stock, those homes are not subject to more modern building codes and that require ignition resistant materials, roofing. In the 70s and 80s, shake shingle roofing was all the rage. It was not just popular, but there are covenants in HOAs across Colorado where that was mandated. You had to put on a shake shingle roof for the aesthetics of it. And, over time we are seeing homeowners association updating those and replacing them with more sensible rules when it comes to wildfire. But certainly the growth means that there are more people who will need to be taking action to make sure that their properties risk is as low as they can make it, and that they're prepared for the possibility of needing to evacuate. And there are great resources available, often through a county emergency manager on guidance on that. And one of the most important thing that somebody living in a fire-prone area should do is to sign up for their local reverse 911 so they get alerted about evacuations.
All right, well, we are coming up against our time here. And let me say, Professor Brenkert-Smith, thank you so much for your time and expertise in fielding all of these questions. We really, really appreciate you providing this opportunity for our audience. We're grateful to learn about this vital and important scholarly work that you're doing. And yeah, we can't say thank you enough for that. And thank you so much also to all of our participants who have asked such fantastic questions and participating in our program today. A couple, ending remarks just to round out our program today. I'd like to appreciate Emily Musumeci and Gretchen Minikheim, who are members of the Office for Outreach and Engagement staff, for providing technical support today. All participants will receive an email with a link to a short Google survey tomorrow, and we very much appreciate your feedback. We look at that feedback and we use that when we're planning upcoming lectures in terms of the themes that we choose, the faculty that we approach. So take some time to do that, and we'd appreciate that. A recording of the lecture will be linked to online by the end of the day on Monday. You can find this on the See You on the Weekend webpage, which is where you registered for today's lecture. And note that the recording will be closed captioned. So this is the second installment of our Fall 2021 See You on the Weekend series. Coming up next on December 4th is a talk titled Rights of Indigenous People and Developing International Law by Professor James Anaya, who is the former dean of the law school at the University of Colorado Boulder. Be sure to register in advance online. And finally, thank you so much again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the weekend again in the future.